I learned a long time ago that the biggest lies usually begin with the smallest complaints. The smell of fresh spring blossoms still drifted through the cool morning air when 3 sheriff's deputies walked across my front lawn with paperwork already in their hands. Their polished boots crunched over white cherry petals that had fallen overnight. The flashing lights reflected across my old pickup truck. Half the neighborhood stood on their porches watching in complete silence. Then someone pointed straight at me. "That's him. He's the one who stole all 72 cherry trees." I almost laughed because the accusation sounded too ridiculous to exist outside a bad television drama. But nobody else was laughing. The deputies remained professional. They asked me to place my hands behind my back while they explained that a formal complaint had been filed. According to several sworn statements, I had organized the overnight theft of an entire private orchard worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. I looked across the street and saw Karen Prescott standing with her arms folded. Her perfectly rehearsed expression almost convinced me she believed every word coming out of her own mouth. Almost. She gave me the kind of smile people wear when they think the story is already over. What she didn't know was that mine hadn't even started yet. My name is Daniel Mercer. Most people in our county knew me as the quiet guy living alone in the weathered farmhouse at the end of Willow Creek Road. I drove an aging Ford F-150 with faded paint. I fixed my own fences. I spent more weekends planting trees than talking to neighbors. People assumed I struggled to pay my bills because I never tried to impress anyone. That assumption would become the most expensive mistake my neighbors ever made. The deputy read the complaint one more time while another photographed my property. The air smelled like damp soil and blooming cherry flowers. A robin landed on my fence as if nothing unusual was happening. I remember thinking how strange it felt that nature could remain perfectly calm while human beings invented disasters from pure arrogance. Karen finally stepped forward. She raised her voice just enough for everyone to hear. She said honest neighborhoods had no place for thieves. A few neighbors nodded without asking a single question. Others pulled out their phones. Within minutes my face was spreading across local social media beside headlines calling me an orchard criminal. My business contacts began sending confused text messages. One client canceled a contract before lunch. Another stopped answering my calls entirely. All because someone decided a few drifting cherry blossoms landing on a freshly mowed lawn deserved revenge. That tiny complaint had somehow become handcuffs. It had become public humiliation. It had become a criminal investigation. And before it was over, it would become a $3 million lesson that none of them would ever forget. The ride to the county courthouse lasted less than 20 minutes. It felt much longer. The deputy sitting beside me treated me with respect. He never assumed I was guilty. He simply followed procedure. I appreciated that more than he probably realized. Outside the window the rolling hills were glowing with fresh spring color. Rows of cherry trees stretched across neighboring farms. Their pale blossoms shimmered under the morning sun like fresh snow. The scent drifted through the cracked window every time we slowed at an intersection. It reminded me why I had built my entire life around trees instead of people. Trees always told the truth. They grew exactly where their roots belong. My grandfather understood that better than anyone. He planted his first orchard in 1968 with little more than determination and a borrowed tractor. My father expanded the family business one careful acre at a time. Neither man became wealthy from cherries alone. They became respected because they honored every contract and every handshake. When I inherited the family property, I promised myself I would protect that reputation no matter what it cost. I studied urban forestry instead of business administration. Most people thought that was strange. I preferred learning how root systems survived droughts over sitting in corporate boardrooms discussing quarterly profits. After college, I spent years consulting on restoration projects across several states. I helped recover orchards after storms. I advised cities on preserving historic tree canopies. I quietly built relationships with growers, surveyors, transportation companies, insurance firms, and environmental engineers. I never advertised any of it. The work spoke for itself. When my parents passed away within 3 years of each other, I returned permanently to Willow Creek Road. I restored the farmhouse with my own hands. Every floorboard carried memories. Every fence post reminded me of weekends spent beside my father measuring property lines before sunrise. The old barn still smelled like cedar lumber, machine oil, and dried hay. Those familiar scents grounded me whenever life became complicated. The neighbors saw an aging farmhouse and an old pickup truck. They assumed I barely kept the lights on. They never asked why contractors from 3 different counties occasionally stopped by for meetings. They never wondered why delivery drivers always greeted me by my first name. They only saw what fit the story they wanted to believe. Karen Prescott especially enjoyed that story. She often described me as stubborn during neighborhood meetings. According to her, I refused to modernize my property. I refused to support new community projects. I refused to cooperate. What she called stubbornness was actually something much simpler. I believed private property deserved respect. I believed agreements mattered. I believed people should solve disagreements with facts instead of pressure. Those beliefs made me unpopular with the small group that wanted complete control over every decision in the neighborhood. Looking back now, I should have recognized the warning signs months earlier. Karen constantly asked unusual questions about property boundaries. She seemed fascinated by old survey markers. She once asked who maintained historical land records for nearby orchards. At the time, I thought she was simply curious. I answered politely and returned to pruning young cherry trees before the afternoon rain arrived. I had no idea those harmless conversations were quietly becoming pieces of a much larger plan. While everyone else believed they were watching an ordinary homeowner fall apart, they completely missed the truth hiding in plain sight. I had spent years documenting land, trees, shipments, ownership records, and environmental compliance with almost obsessive precision. That habit had never failed me before. It was not about to fail me now. Karen Prescott had a talent for making ordinary things sound like emergencies. A mailbox sitting 1 inch too close to the curb became a community safety concern. A vegetable garden became an eyesore that threatened property values. A weathered barn became historical neglect during neighborhood meetings. She spoke with perfect confidence. People stopped asking whether she was right. They only asked what she wanted them to do next. The first time she walked onto my property without calling, I was trimming branches from a young cherry tree after a spring rain. The air smelled like wet bark and fresh grass. Water dripped from every branch. My boots sank slightly into the soft soil with each step. Karen never looked at the trees. She looked past them. Her eyes stayed fixed on the open field behind the orchard. That was the moment I realized she was measuring possibilities instead of admiring nature. She complimented the view with a smile that never reached her eyes. Then she casually mentioned how beautiful a neighborhood recreation park would look on that side of the valley. I simply thanked her for stopping by and returned to my work. She did not appreciate being ignored. A week later, she invited me to a neighborhood planning committee meeting. The room smelled like fresh coffee and printer toner. Large development maps covered the walls. Karen stood beside them like a television presenter unveiling a major project. She explained that the community deserved wider walking trails. She wanted a decorative entrance lined with flowering trees. She wanted picnic areas and seasonal festivals. Everyone applauded. Then she revealed the missing piece. My land sat directly in the middle of her proposed expansion. She described my property as underutilized space that could serve a greater purpose. I politely reminded everyone that private ownership was not a suggestion. It was protected by law. The room became noticeably quieter. Karen smiled again. This time her voice softened enough to sound reasonable. She assured everyone she respected private property. She simply hoped neighbors could cooperate for the good of the community. Several people nodded. I left without another word. The letters started arriving 2 weeks later. One questioned my drainage system. Another suggested my gravel driveway created unnecessary dust. A third claimed my cherry blossoms scattered onto neighboring lawns during windy afternoons. I framed every notice inside a folder instead of throwing them away. Years of consulting had taught me one valuable lesson. Paperwork often reveals intentions long before actions do. Then came the survey requests. Contractors I had never hired appeared near my fence lines carrying measuring equipment. They claimed someone from the neighborhood association had asked them to estimate future improvements. I politely asked them to leave. Most apologized immediately. One quietly admitted Karen insisted expansion plans were practically approved already. That sentence stayed with me. Practically approved. She spoke about my land as though ownership had already changed. Around the same time, several unfamiliar sport utility vehicles began driving slowly past my orchard every weekend. They stopped just long enough for passengers to take photographs. They studied the property lines. They examined the access road leading toward the back acreage. It felt less like curiosity and more like preparation. My old friend Samuel Briggs noticed the pattern before I did. Samuel owned the hardware store 15 miles away. He had lived in the county longer than almost anyone. One afternoon he handed me a receipt for fence supplies and quietly said Karen had been asking unusual questions about orchard values and commercial development permits. He lowered his voice even further before adding that local investors had attended 2 private neighborhood meetings without public notice. The sweet smell of cherry blossoms filled the parking lot while his words settled heavily in my mind. That was when everything finally connected. Karen was never fighting over fallen petals. She was building a story. Every complaint created another page. Every notice created another record. Every meeting gathered another witness willing to repeat her version of events. She believed enough paperwork could eventually outweigh the truth. She had no idea I had spent my entire career proving that records only matter when every single detail survives careful inspection. The hearing ended before I had a real chance to explain anything. The judge scheduled another date after reviewing the initial reports. The criminal investigation stayed active. My attorney advised me to stay quiet until discovery began. That sounded reasonable. It also meant Karen controlled the public conversation for weeks. She wasted no time. Every afternoon another rumor spread across the neighborhood. Someone claimed I had been seen loading mature cherry trees onto flatbed trailers after midnight. Someone else insisted I had secretly sold rare orchard stock to developers across state lines. None of it made sense. Mature cherry trees cannot simply disappear without specialized equipment, permits, transportation planning, and dozens of hours of labor. Facts did not matter anymore. Emotion traveled faster than evidence. The local newspaper printed a short article that repeated the accusations without declaring me guilty. Even so, the damage arrived immediately. My phone stopped ringing. 2 consulting projects were placed on hold. A restoration contract worth almost $200,000 quietly disappeared after a client decided they preferred to avoid unwanted publicity. Years of trust evaporated because strangers believed a headline instead of waiting for the truth. I spent those mornings walking through my orchard before sunrise. The cool air carried the familiar scent of blossoms mixed with damp earth. Bees drifted from flower to flower without caring about court filings or neighborhood gossip. Their quiet routine reminded me that nature never rushed to judgment. Human beings often did. 3 days later I received something even stranger than the criminal complaint. A certified letter arrived from a commercial development group offering to purchase my entire property. The proposed price looked generous at first glance. It was still several $1,000,000 below market value. The timing felt impossible to ignore. I declined without making a counteroffer. Less than 48 hours later another offer arrived through a different company. The wording changed. The numbers changed. The destination remained exactly the same. Someone desperately wanted my land before the investigation reached its conclusion. Samuel Briggs stopped by the farmhouse one evening carrying 2 cups of coffee from the diner outside town. The rich aroma filled my workshop while rain tapped softly against the metal roof. He quietly told me that Karen had recently hosted several closed-door meetings with investors, engineers, and a regional construction firm. No homeowners had been invited. No meeting minutes had been published. Yet expensive vehicles kept arriving after dark. Samuel shook his head before leaving. He had lived long enough to recognize the smell of speculation long before newspapers ever reported it. That conversation changed everything. Until then, I believed Karen wanted control over one piece of land. Now I suspected something much larger. I drove to the county records office the following morning. The old building smelled like aging paper and polished wood. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling holding decades of survey maps and property transfers. A clerk who knew my family greeted me with a quiet smile. She pointed me towards several recent filings involving infrastructure planning near Willow Creek Road. I spent hours turning page after page. Most documents looked ordinary. Then one map caught my attention. A proposed utility corridor crossed directly through the back section of my property. Another document referenced future mixed-use commercial zoning surrounding the same area. My pulse slowed instead of racing. Excitement would only cloud judgment. Careful observation had always served me better than emotion. Karen believed she had trapped an ordinary landowner inside a criminal case. She never considered that every move she made left another official record behind. While she worked to convince everyone that I had stolen 72 trees, she was quietly planting evidence against herself in county offices, planning commissions, and business contracts. She simply did not realize someone else was reading every single page. I left the county records office carrying nothing more than a notebook filled with dates, parcel numbers, and questions. The afternoon breeze carried the sweet scent of blooming orchards across the courthouse parking lot. Most people would have driven home feeling defeated. I felt something completely different. Patterns had started replacing rumors. Facts were beginning to connect. Every false accusation against me seemed to appear only after another development document was quietly submitted somewhere else. That was not coincidence. It was planning. My attorney focused on defending the criminal allegations. I understood why. That was his job. Mine was finding the missing pieces nobody else thought to examine. Instead of arguing with neighbors or answering gossip online, I spent every day following paper trails. I requested transportation permits. I reviewed nursery licensing records. I compared satellite imagery taken only weeks apart. Every evening I spread maps across the old oak table inside my farmhouse. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the familiar scent of cedar from the workshop next door. Color notes slowly covered every corner of the table. One detail refused to leave my mind. 72 mature cherry trees could not simply disappear. Moving trees that size required specialized equipment, commercial carriers, destination permits, insurance documentation, and certified inspections. Someone had completed all of those steps. Someone expected nobody to look for them. My first breakthrough came from an old contact named Richard Lawson. We had worked together years earlier restoring storm-damaged orchards. Richard now managed equipment scheduling for a regional heavy transport company. We met at a roadside diner just outside the county line before sunrise. Fresh bacon, hot coffee, and the smell of warm biscuits filled the small restaurant while truck drivers prepared for another workday. Richard listened quietly as I explained the situation. He did not promise anything. He simply asked one question. Had anyone checked temporary oversized transport permits issued during the week before the trees supposedly disappeared? I admitted I had not. He smiled slightly before wishing me luck. That single suggestion changed everything. Back at the county transportation office, I searched permit records covering 3 neighboring counties. Most involved construction equipment or farm machinery. Then one application immediately caught my attention. A convoy permit had been approved for unusually large nursery stock during the exact week Karen claimed the orchard theft occurred. The destination listed on the permit had been partially redacted because of commercial confidentiality. Even so, several identification numbers remained visible. I copied every one of them. They looked meaningless at first. They were not. Late that evening I opened an old database from one of my previous consulting projects involving commercial nursery logistics. I had retained access because I occasionally served as an environmental compliance consultant. After entering the identification numbers, the system returned a familiar shipping contractor. I recognized the company immediately. They specialized in relocating mature trees for luxury developments. Their equipment was among the best in the state. They also documented every shipment with extraordinary precision because insurance companies demanded it. For the first time since the accusations began, I smiled without forcing it. If those trees had been transported legally, there would be inspection reports. There would be loading records. There would be photographs. There would be timestamps. Most importantly, there would be signatures. I still did not know who signed them. I only knew those documents existed somewhere. The criminal accusations against me suddenly looked much smaller than the commercial operation hiding behind them. Karen believed she had buried the truth beneath neighborhood rumors and dramatic headlines. She never imagined the real story had been preserved by routine business paperwork created by people who had never even heard my name. Sometimes the strongest witness is not a person standing in a courtroom. Sometimes it is an ordinary document that quietly records every mile, every hour, and every signature without caring who eventually gets blamed. 2 mornings later my phone rang just after 6 o'clock. The sunrise painted the orchard in pale gold. A thin layer of mist hovered above the rows of young cherry trees. The familiar scent of damp leaves drifted through the open kitchen window while coffee brewed beside me. The caller identification displayed a name I had not seen in nearly 4 years. Olivia Bennett. Most people knew her as a corporate compliance attorney. I knew her as someone who never called unless she had already verified every fact twice. She skipped the usual greetings. She simply asked if I still had access to the environmental consulting network we had built years earlier. I told her I did. There was a long pause before she quietly said something that completely changed the direction of the case. She had recognized the transportation company listed on the permit numbers I sent the night before. They were not just another contractor. They were one of the largest clients served by Mercer Environmental Logistics. I thanked her without explaining why that name mattered so much. Very few people outside my professional circle knew the Mercer family had never sold the company my grandfather founded decades earlier. We had simply stopped attaching our family name to daily operations. Professional managers handled public business. I preferred consulting work and quiet life over board meetings and newspaper interviews. The arrangement suited everyone. Until now. I drove to one of the company's regional operations centers located almost 80 miles away. The modern building stood behind rows of flowering maple trees. Inside, everything smelled faintly of clean paper, fresh paint, and polished wood. Employees greeted me politely before escorting me upstairs. The regional director stood the moment I entered his office. We shook hands like we always had. No introductions were necessary. I placed the transportation permit numbers on his desk. He studied them for less than 30 seconds before opening a secure database. Every commercial relocation handled by the company generated an electronic chain of documentation. Every truck reported its location through satellite tracking. Every loading crew uploaded photographs before departure and after delivery. Every inspection required digital signatures. The system existed because million-dollar trees could not simply vanish without accountability. The director turned the monitor toward me. There it was. A complete shipment file. 72 mature cherry trees. Loading date. Departure time. Driver identification. Equipment inspections. Fuel receipts. Weight certificates. Route history accurate to within a few yards. The trees had never been stolen. They had been legally transported under a commercial contract signed weeks before Karen ever filed her complaint. I slowly examined every page without saying a word. Then I reached the final signature page. The purchasing entity had been hidden behind a development holding company. That was expected. The authorization signatures were not. One belonged to the president of the development corporation. Another belonged to a licensed landscape architect. The final approval signature came from a neighborhood improvement committee acting as the local project representative. Karen Prescott's name appeared clearly beneath that authorization. The room became perfectly quiet. Nobody needed to explain what we were looking at. The director folded his hands before speaking. Company policy required preserving every electronic record for insurance compliance. Nothing could be altered without creating an audit trail. Multiple backup servers stored identical copies in separate states. Those records had existed from the very beginning. Karen had accused me of stealing trees that she herself had authorized for commercial relocation through an officially documented process. She assumed nobody would ever connect the permits, the shipping records, and the committee paperwork. She also assumed nobody knew who ultimately owned the logistics company preserving every mile of that journey. For the first time since deputies walked across my front lawn, I stopped feeling like someone defending himself. I was no longer searching for the truth. I was holding it in my hands. Karen had spent months building a carefully rehearsed story. She never realized every chapter she wrote had already been quietly archived inside a company that had carried my family name for more than 50 years. The next hearing lasted less than 15 minutes. The prosecutor requested additional time after receiving new evidence from my attorney. The judge agreed. No dramatic speeches filled the courtroom. No one raised their voice. The silence told a much louder story. Karen sat only a few rows away. She still carried the same confident posture she had displayed since the investigation began. She occasionally whispered to the attorney representing the neighborhood association. Every time she glanced in my direction, she looked completely certain the pressure would eventually force me into accepting a settlement and selling my property. She still believed I was defending myself. She had not realized the roles had already reversed. After court adjourned, my legal team gathered inside a conference room overlooking the courthouse square. The room smelled faintly of fresh coffee and leather folders. Sunlight reflected across stacks of neatly organized documents. Olivia Bennett placed 3 binders on the table without saying a word. The first contained every transportation record connected to the 72 cherry trees. The second contained committee meeting minutes, development proposals, and corporate filings collected from multiple public agencies. The third contained communications obtained through lawful discovery. We spent hours arranging every document in chronological order. One event led naturally to the next. The pattern became impossible to ignore. The complaints against my property began only after private development discussions accelerated. The criminal accusation appeared immediately after the commercial relocation of the orchard had already been completed. Every timeline matched perfectly. Every signature supported the same conclusion. My attorney leaned back in his chair and quietly smiled. He said something I will never forget. He said we were no longer preparing a defense. We were preparing accountability. That distinction changed our entire strategy. We chose not to attack Karen publicly. We declined every interview request from local television stations. We ignored social media arguments completely. Instead, subpoenas began reaching the people who had participated in the development project. The engineering consultants received notices. The landscape architecture firm received notices. The holding company purchasing the orchard received notices. The neighborhood association received notices requesting financial records and internal communications. Within days, the tone across town shifted noticeably. People who had eagerly repeated rumors suddenly became cautious. Reporters stopped asking whether I had stolen anything. They started asking why so many commercial records contradicted the original allegations. Then another unexpected development arrived. One of the transportation supervisors voluntarily agreed to provide testimony confirming that every mature tree had been loaded under a scheduled commercial contract with full documentation and authorized representatives present during the relocation. His statement matched the electronic records exactly. Nothing had disappeared overnight. Nothing had been secretly removed. The entire operation had followed ordinary commercial procedures from beginning to end. Karen's original story began collapsing under the weight of routine business paperwork. The neighborhood association attempted to distance itself from her decisions. Several board members claimed they had relied entirely on information Karen presented during closed meetings. That explanation only created more questions. Discovery requests expanded. Financial audits followed. Additional emails surfaced showing discussions about acquiring my property after negative publicity reduced its perceived market value. Every new document strengthened the same conclusion. The accusations had never been about missing trees. They had been about creating leverage. I remained exactly where I had always been. I walked my orchard every morning before sunrise. I repaired fences. I trimmed young branches. I listened to birds settling into the trees while cool spring air carried the familiar fragrance of blossoms across the valley. The difference was that I no longer carried uncertainty with me. Karen believed power belonged to the loudest voice in the room. She believed repeated accusations eventually became accepted truth. She underestimated something far more durable than rumors. A complete record. A patient investigation. And a legal process that rewards evidence long after public opinion has already rushed to judgment. She thought she had cornered a quiet homeowner. She never realized she had built an entire case against herself, one signed document at a time. The civil trial began on a clear Monday morning. Sunlight poured through the courthouse windows and settled across polished wooden tables that had witnessed decades of ordinary disputes. This case was anything but ordinary. Every seat inside the gallery filled before the judge entered. Local reporters lined the back wall carrying notebooks instead of cameras because the court prohibited live broadcasting. The air smelled faintly of old paper, fresh coffee, and furniture polish. Nobody spoke above a whisper. Everyone sensed the story had changed. My attorney stood first. He did not begin with opinions. He began with dates. Every document appeared on the courtroom screens in perfect chronological order. The transportation permits came first. Then the commercial contracts. Then the inspection reports. Then the satellite tracking records. Finally came the digital authorization signed by Karen Prescott on behalf of the Neighborhood Improvement Committee. The courtroom remained completely silent, while each page appeared one after another. There was no dramatic surprise. Only quiet certainty. Karen's attorney objected several times. Each objection failed after the foundation for every document had already been established through certified custodians and sworn testimony. The transportation supervisor explained how mature cherry trees were relocated. The insurance representative described the documentation required before any shipment could leave a property. An environmental inspector confirmed the trees had been examined before loading and after delivery. Every witness repeated the same basic truth. The relocation had been lawful from beginning to end. Then came the financial records. That was when the entire picture finally emerged. Internal emails showed that several investors believed my property would become significantly easier to acquire if my reputation collapsed under public suspicion. Meeting notes discussed expected decreases in market value following negative publicity. Draft proposals outlined future commercial development stretching across the exact acreage Karen had tried so hard to obtain. Nobody had expected those records to become part of a courtroom exhibit. Yet there they were. Line after line. Date after date. Signature after signature. The judge carefully reviewed each exhibit before allowing it into evidence. By late afternoon, the original criminal allegations looked almost unrecognizable compared to the documented timeline now sitting in front of the court. The prosecutor handling the earlier investigation formally acknowledged that newly verified evidence completely undermined the accusations against me. The remaining criminal matter was dismissed. My name was cleared in open court. That moment mattered more to me than any financial award ever could. My parents had spent their lives protecting our family reputation. Hearing the record corrected felt like honoring them all over again. The civil claims continued. The jury later concluded that false statements and coordinated actions had caused measurable damage to my business, professional reputation, and contractual relationships. The court entered judgment in my favor. The total award reached $3 million. News spread across the county before the paperwork was even finalized. The consequences reached far beyond one judgment. The neighborhood association's insurance carrier began reviewing coverage issues. Planned commercial financing stalled while additional legal questions remained unresolved. Investors withdrew from the proposed development rather than continue under growing uncertainty. Contracts that once looked guaranteed quietly disappeared. Several board members resigned within weeks. Karen no longer controlled neighborhood meetings. She no longer stood confidently at the front of crowded rooms explaining what everyone else should believe. She spent her time responding to legal obligations created by decisions she had personally approved. I never celebrated any of it. I simply watched the legal process finish exactly what evidence had started. The smallest complaint in the neighborhood had grown into one of the largest legal disasters our county had seen in years. All because someone believed a handful of drifting cherry blossoms justified destroying another person's life. In the end, it was not anger that defeated Karen. It was documentation. It was patience. And it was the simple truth preserved inside ordinary records that never forgot a single signature. The following spring arrived almost exactly 1 year after deputies first walked across my front lawn. The valley looked the way I always remembered it. Morning sunlight drifted through rows of young cherry trees. A gentle breeze carried the familiar fragrance of fresh blossoms across the fields. Birds settled onto newly grown branches as though nothing extraordinary had ever happened there. Nature had quietly moved forward. Eventually, so had I. The civil judgment became final after the remaining appeals ended. The compensation helped restore the consulting projects I had lost. More importantly, every public record reflected what had actually happened. Clients returned one by one. Some apologized for believing the rumors. Others admitted they simply became afraid after seeing my name connected to a criminal investigation. I never blamed them. Fear often spreads faster than facts. Trust simply takes longer to grow back. Instead of expanding my business, I made a different decision. A portion of the judgment funded a community orchard education program for local schools. Every spring, students visited the property to learn how healthy trees were planted, maintained, and preserved. They measured soil moisture. They studied root systems. They planted young cherry saplings with their own hands. Watching children care about the next generation of trees reminded me why my grandfather loved this land in the first place. It had never been about ownership alone. It had always been about stewardship. The proposed commercial development quietly disappeared after investors withdrew. Without financing and public support, the project no longer made financial sense. The neighborhood association elected an entirely new board. Meeting agendas became public. Financial records became easier for homeowners to review. Independent legal counsel attended major decisions. The culture changed because people finally understood how much damage could grow from unchecked authority mixed with unquestioned assumptions. Karen Prescott moved away several months after the litigation concluded. I never saw her again. I did not celebrate her departure. I did not need revenge beyond what the legal system had already delivered. The consequences of her own decisions had spoken far more clearly than anything I could have said. Samuel Briggs still visits every few weeks. We drink coffee on the farmhouse porch while watching the orchard wake up with each new season. Sometimes we laugh about how many strangers now stop to admire the cherry blossoms that once started so much unnecessary conflict. He likes to remind me that the smallest seeds often grow into the strongest trees. I usually smile because I know the same thing is true about the truth. It starts quietly. It takes patience. But once its roots are deep enough, nothing can pull it out. Every now and then someone driving through the county recognizes my name from old newspaper articles. They ask whether the stories were really true. I simply point toward the orchard stretching across the hillside. The trees answer better than I ever could. They are still standing. They are still growing. They never cared about rumors. They only responded to careful hands and honest work. Looking back now, the entire disaster began with something so unbelievably small that most people would never believe it. A few drifting cherry blossoms landed on the wrong lawn. One person decided pride mattered more than truth. That single choice triggered investigations, lawsuits, failed development plans, millions of dollars in losses, and the complete collapse of a carefully constructed lie. I learned that justice does not always arrive quickly. It rarely arrives loudly. More often, it appears one document at a time. One verified record at a time. One honest witness at a time. In the end, I did not win because I was wealthier than anyone believed. I won because I never stopped respecting the facts. Cherry trees have a simple lesson if you watch them long enough. Strong roots remain invisible until the storm arrives. Then suddenly everyone understands why they never fell.